They didn't just betray their faith, they hunted the people who trusted them. These are the preachers who used the pulpit as a weapon. Millions trusted them as spiritual leaders, but behind closed doors, they were hiding crimes darker than anyone imagined. Tonight, we expose pastors who used faith as their greatest weapon. The story of Warren Jeffs is a chilling example of a spiritual leader whose pursuit of wealth and power eclipsed every moral and ethical boundary. Jeffs rose to prominence as the president of the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, FLDS, presented himself as a prophet, a man directly chosen by God to guide his followers. From the outside, his ministry promised divine guidance, eternal salvation, and blessings for those who obeyed his teachings. Yet behind the facade of righteousness lay a system of manipulation, control, and exploitation designed to consolidate his power, expand his wealth, and silence dissent. Warren Jeffs was born into a polygamist family in the 1950s in Utah. From an early age, he was groomed to assume a leadership role within the FLD, a sect that splintered from mainstream Mormonism and adhered to practices long outlawed, including plural marriage. His father, Rulon Jeffs, was the church's prophet and patriarch, and young Warren observed closely how authority and religious reverence could be used to command obedience and instill loyalty. He learned the mechanics of control, the careful balance of fear, reward, and religious justification, and how personal ambition could be cloaked as divine mandate. By the time he assumed leadership after his father's death in 2002, he was already well versed in using the trappings of faith to achieve his own ends. Once in power, Jeffs expanded the influence of the FLDS through a combination of charisma, fear, and meticulous organization. He traveled extensively among FLDS communities in Utah and Arizona, delivering sermons that framed obedience as a pathway to salvation. He dictated personal aspects of his followers' lives, including who they could marry, where they could live, and how they were expected to contribute financially to the church. Jeffs insisted that tithes and offerings be paid promptly, framing them as divine requirements and the cornerstone of spiritual devotion. Those who questioned him were cast out, shunned, or threatened with eternal damnation. In this environment, wealth accumulation was not incidental. It was a manifestation of obedience and loyalty, reinforcing his authority and control. Jeffs' methods of financial exploitation were sophisticated. Members of the FLDS were required to turn over land, property, and money to the church, often at below market value, under the pretense that their contributions would support religious activities and community welfare. In reality, Jeffs maintained a luxurious lifestyle funded by these contributions. He owned multiple properties, maintained personal vehicles, and controlled a network of assets that enabled him to consolidate influence, while keeping the congregation in a state of dependency. His financial empire was not just about material gain, it was a mechanism of power, ensuring that followers remained beholden to his directives and unable to challenge his authority without risking economic and social ruin. The darker aspect of Jeffs' leadership extended beyond finances. He systematically manipulated the lives of vulnerable members, particularly young women and girls, arranging marriages that reinforced his power and the loyalty of their families. He dictated intimate relationships, leveraging religious doctrine to coerce compliance. Girls as young as 12 were married off to older men or to Jeffs himself, often under threat of spiritual punishment or ostracization. Families who resisted faced social isolation, threats, and a looming specter of divine disfavor. This combination of moral authority, psychological pressure, and financial control created a culture in which questioning leadership was nearly impossible. The situation reached a tipping point when former members began speaking out. They described the pervasive fear, the financial exploitation, and the systemic abuse of women and children. One former follower recalled being forced to surrender her personal savings to the church under the threat of divine wrath. Another spoke of the emotional trauma of being separated from family members who refused to comply with Jeffs' directives. The narratives were consistent, a pattern of manipulation, coercion, and exploitation designed to maintain absolute loyalty to the leader. Media scrutiny intensified after Jeffs was placed on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list in 2006. He had fled after being charged with multiple counts of sexual misconduct involving minors. Law enforcement investigations revealed the breadth of his criminal enterprise. Not only had he committed sexual crimes, but he had also directed a system that coerced members into giving money and property under the guise of religious duty. The financial aspect of his operation, the forced contributions, the seizure of assets, the economic control of his followers was inextricably linked to his ability to maintain social and spiritual dominance. Wealth and power were tools of compliance, not incidental rewards. The legal proceedings against Jeffs were complex and widely publicized. He was eventually convicted of sexual assault and sentenced to life in prison, plus additional years for aggravated sexual assault of minors. The convictions marked a rare instance in which a leader with enormous religious authority faced accountability. However, the repercussions of his actions extended far beyond the courtroom. Families were fractured, communities traumatized, and trust in spiritual leadership profoundly shaken. The financial exploitation alone left many members in economic hardship, having surrendered property, savings, or other assets that were never returned. The psychological impact on his followers was profound. Many had invested not only their money, but their faith, their identity, and their sense of morality in Jeffs' leadership. The revelation of his crimes, sexual exploitation, manipulation, and financial coercion, created a dual sense of betrayal, spiritual and material. Those who left the FLDS described years of confusion, shame, and difficulty trusting both religious institutions and personal relationships. The manipulation of faith as a tool for personal gain left scars that extended far beyond the immediate victims of sexual abuse or financial coercion. It eroded the very foundation of communal and individual morality. Jeffs' story also catalyzed broader public discourse about the intersection of religion, power, and wealth. Legal scholars, sociologists, and theologians debated how charismatic leaders could wield authority in ways that bypassed traditional accountability mechanisms. Law enforcement agencies studied the mechanisms of control within closed religious communities, highlighting how economic dependence, social isolation, and doctrinal enforcement can combine to suppress dissent and conceal wrongdoing. The FLDS case became emblematic of the dangers inherent when spiritual authority is unchecked, particularly in insular communities with minimal external oversight. For survivors, recovery was both personal and financial. Many sought restitution for property and funds lost under Jeffs' direction. Counseling and therapy became essential for those recovering from the trauma of manipulation and abuse. Communities had to rebuild trust internally, reconcile spiritual beliefs with the reality of betrayal, and implement safeguards to prevent recurrence. The process was slow, painful, and ongoing, underscoring how the consequences of a leader's greed and moral compromise can resonate for generations. The haunting takeaway from Warren Jeffs' case is the extreme danger posed when spiritual authority is subordinated to personal ambition. Jeffs promised divine guidance, blessings, and community cohesion, but he delivered exploitation, fear, and financial control. His actions demonstrate that faith, when manipulated by unscrupulous leadership, can be converted into a mechanism of power and enrichment, leaving followers vulnerable to material and emotional devastation. It is a stark reminder that morality and money must never be allowed to become interchangeable in the hands of those who claim divine authority. Even today, the shadow of Jeffs' leadership lingers. Former followers continue to grapple with the dual impact of spiritual and financial exploitation. The case remains a reference point for discussions on religious accountability, the ethical responsibilities of clergy, and the need for vigilance in communities where authority is concentrated in a single individual. The story of Warren Jeffs is not merely a tale of personal corruption, it is a cautionary narrative about the human cost when faith is weaponized, trust is violated, and wealth is pursued at the expense of morality. What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. The story of Jim Bakker is a notorious chapter in American religious history, demonstrating how a charismatic pastor can manipulate faith for personal enrichment while betraying the trust of millions. Jim Bakker rose to fame in the 1970s and 1980s as the co-founder and host of the PTL, Praise the Lord Club, a televangelist program that attracted a vast audience through its mix of preaching, entertainment, and promises of spiritual reward. On-screen, Bakker was a captivating figure, eloquent, energetic, and seemingly deeply devoted to the message of prosperity and divine favor. But behind the smiles, applause, and televised fundraising appeals was a complex web of financial manipulation, sexual misconduct, an abuse of power that would ultimately collapse his empire and shake the faith of countless followers. Bakker's early career reflected ambition and ingenuity. Born in 1940 in the Midwest, he began preaching as a young man and quickly demonstrated an aptitude for public speaking and media engagement. By the late 1960s, he had founded the PTL Club with his wife, Tammy Faye Bakker, combining ministry with a televised platform that allowed him to reach millions. The program offered spiritual guidance, musical performances, and emotional testimonials from believers, all designed to create a sense of intimacy and personal connection with viewers. Its success was meteoric, establishing Bakker as a household name and securing his position as one of the most influential televangelists in the United States. Central to Bakker's appeal was the message of prosperity gospel, the assertion that donations to the ministry would result in divine blessings, financial success, and personal fulfillment. Viewers were encouraged to give generously, with the promise that God would multiply their offerings and reward their faith. Bakker frequently presented himself as a mediator of God's grace, suggesting that through contributions, individuals could participate in the manifestation of divine power. The language was emotionally compelling, blending scriptural references with anecdotal success stories and appeals to personal need. For many, the act of giving was not only a religious obligation, but also a deeply emotional investment, rooted in trust, hope, and devotion. As PTL's influence expanded, so did Bakker's financial empire. The ministry acquired a range of assets, including television studios, real estate, and luxury accommodations for its leaders. Bakker's personal lifestyle became increasingly extravagant, funded by the very donations solicited from viewers. He purchased luxury cars, expensive clothing, and properties that were presented to the public as part of his ministry's operational needs. While critics argued they were clear indicators of personal enrichment, the line between spiritual mission and financial exploitation blurred, and the system of giving encouraged sustained, often excessive, contributions from followers. The situation became more complex with the construction of Heritage USA, a Christian-themed amusement park and resort that Bakker developed in Fort Mill, South Carolina. The project was portrayed as an extension of the ministry's mission, a place for families to worship, relax, and participate in religious events. However, the development relied heavily on donated funds, often collected under the pretense of spiritual obligation. The project's costs ballooned into the hundreds of millions, while Bakker and his associates benefited from lucrative management contracts, personal accommodations, and control over significant financial resources. Heritage USA became both a symbol of PTL's public success and an emblem of the private excesses that would ultimately lead to scandal. The tipping point came in the late 1980s, when investigative journalists began scrutinizing the ministry's finances and operations. Reports revealed that contributions were being misused, that there were irregularities in accounting practices, and that donations solicited from the faithful were being diverted to fund lavish personal lifestyles. The investigations also uncovered allegations of sexual misconduct. Bakker was accused of engaging in an extramarital affair and of coercing subordinate staff members, including using his authority to manipulate sexual behavior. The convergence of financial impropriety and personal misconduct created a storm that exposed the vulnerabilities inherent in highly centralized religious organizations. In 1987, the scandal reached national prominence. Bakker resigned from PTL under intense public pressure, and legal proceedings were initiated to address allegations of fraud, conspiracy, and financial mismanagement. The courts examined the extent to which donor funds had been misappropriated, where the promises of spiritual reward had been used to manipulate contributions, and the role of oversight mechanisms within the ministry. The legal process was complicated, involving detailed forensic accounting, testimony from former employees and donors, and extensive media coverage that shaped public perception. The scope of the scandal highlighted not only Bakker's personal misconduct, but also the systemic risks posed by unregulated televangelist operations. In 1989, Bakker was convicted on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy, receiving a lengthy prison sentence. The conviction underscored the severity of his violations, exploiting the faith, trust, and financial resources of followers for personal gain. The court proceedings revealed a calculated pattern of deception. Donors were solicited under the guise of divine obligation. Contributions were mismanaged or diverted, and followers were misled about the use and purpose of their gifts. The sentence served as both punishment and deterrent, signaling that spiritual authority does not grant immunity from accountability. The aftermath of Bakker's fall was profound and thousands of PTL viewers felt betrayed, experiencing both financial loss and emotional distress. Many had donated life savings, believing they were investing in a sacred mission. Families reported strained relationships, financial hardship, and shattered faith in religious institutions. The scandal also prompted widespread public discourse about the responsibilities of religious leaders, the dangers of unchecked authority, and the ethical limits of fundraising in faith-based organizations. The narrative became a cautionary tale, illustrating how charisma and media presence can obscure misconduct and facilitate exploitation. For Bakker himself, prison provided both confinement and reflection. Though the damage he inflicted on followers' trust and financial well-being could not be undone. After serving a portion of his sentence, he was released and returned to ministry work, though on a significantly reduced scale. His later efforts focused on smaller congregations and personal speaking engagements, with his past serving as a constant reminder of the consequences of prioritizing personal wealth over spiritual responsibility. Despite rehabilitation attempts, the legacy of PTL remains a stark warning. When moral boundaries are crossed in pursuit of money, the fallout is devastating, not only for the perpetrator, but for countless followers whose trust was betrayed. The psychological toll on those affected by Bakker's actions was profound. Devotees who had invested emotionally and financially experienced disillusionment, a crisis of faith, and skepticism toward future religious leadership. Some reported ongoing struggles with depression and financial insecurity, while others grappled with the betrayal of deeply held beliefs. Families who had encouraged participation in PTL's programs faced internal conflict and guilt, questioning how they could have been misled. The human cost of the scandal extended far beyond court judgments or media coverage, emphasizing that exploitation within religious contexts has lasting and multidimensional consequences. Ultimately, Jim Bakker's story is a stark reminder of the vulnerability inherent in placing unquestioning faith in spiritual leaders. He promised blessings, guidance, and community, yet he delivered manipulation, deceit, and financial exploitation. The PTL scandal serves as a case study in the dangers of combining media influence, charismatic authority, and financial solicitation without transparency or accountability. It illustrates the destructive potential of moral compromise when personal ambition and wealth supersede spiritual responsibility. For those who trusted Jim Bakker, the experience left a deep and enduring impact. It shattered confidence in religious leadership, disrupted communities, and altered the trajectory of individual lives. The lesson is clear: faith, hope, and devotion are sacred. But when wielded by those who prioritize personal gain over morality, they can become instruments of betrayal and loss. Bakker's rise and fall remains one of the most vivid examples in modern religious history of how spiritual authority can be corrupted by greed, ambition, and the relentless pursuit of money over morals. What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. The story of Hinn is a revealing account of how immense influence, spiritual authority, and public trust can be exploited for personal wealth and comfort. Hinn, known for his miracle crusades and televised healing services, built an empire that spanned decades, attracting millions of viewers and followers from around the world. Two audiences. Hinn was a spiritual conduit, a man who could channel divine power, perform miraculous healings, and deliver tangible blessings to those willing to embrace faith. Yet beneath the spectacle of healing services and promises of prosperity lay a calculated system in which donations were solicited, trust was manipulated, and wealth was amassed, raising questions about the ethical limits of religious leadership. Hinn was born in 1952 in Jaffa, Israel, into a Greek Orthodox family, but he converted to Pentecostalism as a young man and quickly developed a reputation for spiritual fervor and public charisma. By the 1970s, he was traveling extensively, preaching revival meetings, and attracting a devoted following in North America. Hinn's early sermons emphasized faith, divine healing, and the power of God to transform lives, which resonated deeply with audiences seeking hope, relief from illness, and spiritual reassurance. His appeal was not merely theological but psychological. He instilled a sense of possibility, belonging, and empowerment, creating a loyal base of followers who believed his ministry was divinely sanctioned. The The expansion of Hinn ministries coincided with the rise of televangelism and the global reach of television networks. His miracle crusades were broadcast internationally, allowing Hinn to connect with millions of viewers, solicit donations, and cultivate a brand synonymous with divine healing and financial prosperity. He encouraged congregants to give generously, framing contributions as a spiritual act that would unlock God's blessings in their own lives. The theology of giving was deeply intertwined with the prosperity gospel. Donors were promised that their offerings would result in healing, protection, financial success, and favor. The messaging was powerful, emotionally compelling, and extremely effective in generating substantial revenue. By the 1990s, Hinn's ministry had grown into a multi-million-dollar operation, with revenue streams derived from televised donations, book sales, overseas tours, and merchandise associated with his teachings. Investigations later revealed the scale of Hinn's financial empire. Private jets, luxury homes, and opulent accommodations for himself and ministry staff were funded by donations from followers, who often contributed far beyond their means. Critics accused Hinn of exploiting faith to finance a lavish lifestyle, arguing that the spiritual and emotional manipulation of congregants was an integral part of his fundraising strategy. In public, Hinn maintained that the wealth was necessary to further God's work, but the disparity between the lives of donors and the luxury of the ministry raised ethical and legal concerns. The controversy surrounding Hinn escalated in the early 2000s when investigative journalists, religious watchdog groups, and regulatory authorities began examining the financial practices of his ministry. Reports highlighted inconsistencies in accounting, potential misappropriation of funds, and extravagant expenditures that appeared unrelated to charitable or spiritual purposes. Critics argued that the accumulation of wealth by Hinn and his inner circle was disproportionate to the needs of the ministry's charitable or spiritual mission, suggesting a pattern in which public trust was leveraged for personal gain. The emotional and spiritual impact on followers was profound. Many individuals donated life savings or relied on Hinn's promises of divine intervention during desperate periods of illness, debt, or personal crisis. When miracles failed to materialize as promised, some followers experienced disillusionment, emotional distress, and a crisis of faith. The sense of betrayal was compounded by the realization that contributions intended to facilitate spiritual and communal good had instead funded a system designed to elevate the pastor's personal wealth and status. The resulting psychological trauma was widespread, affecting both individual believers and broader communities that had invested emotionally and financially in the ministry. Hinn faced public scrutiny on multiple fronts. In 2007, a U.S. Senate investigation into televangelists specifically questioned the financial practices of Hinn and other prominent ministries. The investigation sought to determine whether tax-exempt donations were being used appropriately, whether donors were misled regarding the purpose of their contributions, and whether oversight mechanisms were sufficient to prevent abuse. Although Hinn ultimately cooperated with authorities and maintained that he had not intentionally defrauded anyone, the publicity surrounding the investigation intensified criticism and exposed the vulnerability of followers who trusted him implicitly. The legal and regulatory attention also prompted introspection within religious communities. Scholars and theologians debated the ethical boundaries of prosperity gospel teachings, emphasizing the tension between encouraging generosity and exploiting faith for personal enrichment. Hinn's case became emblematic of the broader risks associated with charismatic leadership in unregulated or lightly regulated religious organizations. It illustrated how public influence, media reach, and personal charisma could be used to solicit funds on a massive scale while minimizing accountability. Beyond finances, Hinn's ministry also faced allegations of emotional and psychological manipulation. Attendees at his crusades described highly charged environments in which individuals were encouraged to surrender not only money, but personal autonomy and critical judgment in exchange for spiritual rewards. Hinn's rhetorical strategies created a sense of urgency, fear of divine disfavor, and moral obligation, further reinforcing the congregation's willingness to comply. This dynamic of authority and control, combined with the promise of miraculous outcomes, exemplified the ways in which power could be exercised under the guise of spiritual leadership. The aftermath of the scandal and public scrutiny did not end Hinn's influence, though it did alter public perception. He continued to travel, preach, and maintain a television presence, but the warnings to prospective donors and the heightened skepticism among religious communities created a more cautious environment. Followers who remained loyal often did so from personal conviction, selective interpretation of teachings, or belief in the transformative power of Hinn's services, while others distanced themselves entirely, disillusioned by what they perceived as the exploitation of trust for personal gain. The enduring lesson from Benny Hinn's story is the dual-edged nature of charisma and spiritual authority. Hinn promised healing, prosperity, and divine favor, but delivered a system in which faith was monetized. Personal loyalty was extracted, and donations were converted into personal wealth. For followers, the betrayal was not merely financial, it was existential, challenging deeply held beliefs about morality, trust, and the integrity of religious leadership. The story underscores the necessity of accountability, transparency, and ethical oversight in religious institutions, particularly those with large followings and significant financial inflows. For individuals affected, the psychological and emotional consequences were lasting. Many experienced difficulty reconciling their faith with the reality of Hinn's practices. Families struggled with the tension between devotion and critical evaluation, while communities faced the challenge of restoring trust and rebuilding spiritual cohesion. Hinn's rise and the eventual exposure of questionable practices serve as a cautionary tale, demonstrating that the pursuit of personal wealth, when cloaked in spiritual authority, can devastate both individual lives and collective trust in religious institutions. Ultimately, Benny Hinn's story is a stark reminder that when pastors choose money over morals, the cost is borne by those who placed their faith in them. The allure of prosperity gospel, charisma, and promises of divine intervention can mask the manipulation and exploitation that occur behind the scenes. Hinn's ministry illustrates the vulnerabilities inherent in systems that combine spiritual authority with financial solicitation, emphasizing the enduring need for vigilance, oversight, and ethical accountability in religious leadership. It is a lesson in trust, betrayal, and the fragile line between spiritual guidance and exploitation. What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. The story of Robert Tilton is a disturbing account of a spiritual leader whose pursuit of wealth overshadowed every moral obligation to his followers. Robert Tilton, once a prominent televangelist in the 1980s and 1990s, rose to fame through his program Success in Life, which combined motivational preaching, televised prayers, and solicitation of donations with promises of divine blessing. Tilton's message resonated with millions of Americans who sought hope, financial security, and spiritual guidance. His sermons emphasized that God rewards faithfulness, obedience, and giving, particularly through financial contributions to the ministry. On the surface, Tilton appeared devoted to uplifting the faithful, but investigations revealed a calculated exploitation of trust, faith, and generosity. Tilton's early career reflected a combination of ambition, showmanship, and religious zeal. Born in 1946 in Texas, he began preaching in local churches and quickly demonstrated an ability to connect with audiences through both oratory and theatrics. By the late 1970s, he had transitioned to television, recognizing the immense potential of media to expand his ministry. His program Success in Life broadcast to millions of households nationwide, using compelling testimonials, inspirational messages, and personal appeals to solicit donations. Tilton's charisma, combined with the persuasive techniques of televised ministry, created a strong emotional bond between him and his viewers. Audiences felt personally connected to his message, believing that contributions would not only support the ministry, but also bring blessings into their own lives. Central to Tilton's financial strategy was the concept of seed faith giving. Viewers were encouraged to send money, often substantial amounts, to the ministry as a demonstration of faith. Tilton presented this practice as a way to activate divine favor. The more a believer gave, the greater the spiritual reward they would receive. Letters and phone calls were sent to donors, reinforcing the notion that financial contributions were spiritually essential. Testimonials from miracle recipients, often staged or exaggerated, were used to encourage compliance, creating an environment in which faith and financial giving were tightly intertwined. By the late 1980s, Tilton's ministry had grown into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. Investigations later revealed that donations were being mismanaged, misappropriated, or diverted for personal benefit. Tilton personally benefited from extravagant salaries, luxurious housing, and high-cost production for his broadcasts, which included expensive trips, elaborate television sets, and lavish events. Critics argued that these expenditures were inconsistent with the claimed spiritual mission of the ministry and reflected a deliberate strategy to monetize trust and devotion. In effect, Tilton had turned acts of faith into a revenue-generating mechanism that enriched himself at the expense of his followers. The scandal surrounding Tilton's operations intensified in the early 1990s when investigative journalism exposed financial misconduct. ABC's Primetime Live conducted an extensive investigation, revealing that donation envelopes from viewers were being discarded or ignored. Even as Tilton publicly promised that each contribution would yield blessings, donors were misled to believe that their money was being used for charitable purposes, healing services, and ministry expansion, while a significant portion was diverted to fund Tilton's personal lifestyle. The reports painted a picture of systemic deception, highlighting the ways in which media influence, charisma, and religious authority had been leveraged to mislead millions. Tilton's response to the scandal was mixed. Publicly, he denied intentional wrongdoing, claiming that all contributions were used appropriately and that any discrepancies were administrative errors. Internally, however, legal documents and testimony revealed that the ministry had maintained an organizational culture in which financial transparency was minimal and accountability structures were weak. Employees and volunteers, many of whom were committed to the stated mission, were often unaware of how funds were being allocated, leaving donors vulnerable to exploitation. The emotional impact on followers was profound. Millions of Americans had invested not only money, but faith and hope in Tilton's ministry. Families who donated significant portions of their savings experienced financial hardship, while others felt spiritually betrayed by a leader they had trusted implicitly. The realization that the promises of divine blessing were often tied to manipulated or misrepresented contributions led to disillusionment, shame, and a crisis of faith for many. Religious scholars later cited Tilton's case as an example of the psychological and emotional consequences of exploiting spiritual authority for financial gain. Legal actions against Tilton included investigations by the Internal Revenue Service and other regulatory bodies, which sought to determine whether the ministry's tax-exempt status had been abused, and whether funds were being misappropriated. While Tilton faced civil suits and was required to restructure his ministry's financial operations, criminal charges were largely avoided, reflecting the challenges of prosecuting complex financial schemes within religious organizations. Nevertheless, the public exposure of Tilton's practices significantly damaged his reputation and the credibility of his ministry. Tilton's story also catalyzed broader discussions about accountability in religious institutions. Questions arose regarding the ethics of soliciting donations under the guise of spiritual obligation, the responsibility of televangelists to maintain financial transparency, and the mechanisms necessary to prevent the exploitation of vulnerable followers. His case illustrated the vulnerability of viewers who, motivated by faith and hope, were persuaded to contribute without full knowledge of how their donations would be used. It also highlighted the need for media literacy and regulatory oversight in contexts where religious authority intersects with financial solicitation. The long-term consequences of Tilton's actions extended beyond financial loss. Many followers reported enduring psychological distress, feelings of betrayal, and difficulty trusting religious leaders in the future. Communities that had supported success in life were forced to reconcile the public persona of a charismatic, devout pastor with the reality of manipulation and personal enrichment. The experience prompted reflection on the delicate balance between faith, obedience, and critical evaluation of leadership. Ultimately, Robert Tilton's story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers inherent when pastors choose money over morals. He promised spiritual guidance, divine blessings, and hope to millions, yet delivered exploitation, deception, and financial abuse. His legacy underscores the importance of ethical accountability, transparency, and vigilance in religious leadership. The emotional and spiritual damage experienced by followers highlights that the cost of betrayal in faith-based contexts is profound and multifaceted, touching both personal well-being and communal trust. The case of Robert Tilton demonstrates how charisma, media influence, and spiritual authority can be weaponized to extract resources from devoted followers. It is a stark reminder that leadership in faith contexts carries immense responsibility, and that moral compromise for financial gain can devastate lives in ways that resonate far beyond the immediate moment. The story challenges religious institutions, followers, and society to remain vigilant, demanding integrity, transparency, and ethical conduct from those who hold positions of spiritual power. For those who trusted Robert Tilton, the consequences were enduring: financial loss, spiritual disillusionment, and a deep sense of betrayal. Yet the lessons of his rise and fall continue to resonate, offering a powerful reminder of the vulnerability of trust, the seductive power of charisma, and the imperative that morality must never be sacrificed in pursuit of wealth. Tilton's story remains one of the most infamous examples of televangelist exploitation, illustrating the consequences when faith is commodified, and when pastors prioritize personal enrichment over ethical leadership. What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. The story of Eddie Long is a harrowing example of how pastoral authority can be leveraged to exploit faith, finances, and trust. Eddie Long, a prominent bishop of New Birth Missionary Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia, rose to national attention as a charismatic spiritual leader with a congregation that swelled into tens of thousands. Known for his compelling sermons, magnetic presence, and promises of prosperity and spiritual guidance, Long cultivated a devoted following who placed deep trust in his leadership. Yet beneath the polished public image, allegations of financial manipulation, coercion, and abuse emerged, revealing a pattern in which the pursuit of wealth and control overshadowed moral responsibility. Eddie Long was born in 1953 in Charlotte, North Carolina, and his early life was marked by a strong commitment to religion and public service. He demonstrated exceptional speaking skills and quickly became involved in ministry work, eventually founding New Birth Missionary Baptist Church in the 1980s. From its early years, the church attracted a growing congregation, drawn to Long's energetic preaching, inspirational messaging, and focus on personal empowerment. His sermons often emphasized that faith, obedience, and financial contributions were pathways to spiritual and material blessings, framing giving as both a religious duty and a spiritual investment. Long's rise coincided with the proliferation of megachurches in the United States, which relied on media, charisma, and expansive congregations to expand influence and revenue. He leveraged television, print, and live events to reach thousands of followers, creating an image of a spiritual authority who could transform lives. Within the church, the culture reinforced loyalty to leadership, encouraging members to trust Long implicitly, submit to his guidance, and contribute financially in support of church initiatives. The combination of spiritual influence and media presence enabled Long to consolidate both authority and wealth, creating a system in which personal devotion was tied closely to material support. Financially, Eddie Long's ministry became a multi-million-dollar operation. Reports indicated that the church purchased luxury properties, maintained expensive vehicles, and funded high-cost projects under the guise of spiritual mission work. Followers were encouraged to give generously, often exceeding their means, with the understanding that their donations would yield divine favor and prosperity. Investigations later revealed that these contributions were frequently used to support Long's lavish lifestyle, as well as to consolidate power within the church hierarchy. The disparity between the spiritual promises offered to followers and the personal enrichment of Long became a focal point of criticism and controversy. The scandal surrounding Eddie Long escalated in 2010, when multiple young men came forward alleging sexual misconduct and coercion. These claims described a pattern of exploitation in which Long allegedly used his pastoral authority to manipulate vulnerable congregants, including offering mentorship and support in exchange for sexual acts. Although these allegations were eventually settled out of court, they exposed a disturbing dynamic in which trust, devotion, and faith were weaponized to serve the personal desires of a leader. The combination of financial control, spiritual authority, and coercive behavior revealed a deeply troubling exploitation of power. Public and media reactions were intense. News outlets covered the allegations, drawing national attention to the operations of New Birth Missionary Baptist Church and Long's personal conduct. Commentators debated the ethical responsibilities of religious leaders, highlighting the dangers of centralized authority, lack of oversight, and the potential for manipulation when followers' faith is unquestioned. For many congregants, the exposure of Long's misconduct was devastating, leaving them to grapple with feelings of betrayal, shame, and spiritual confusion. The emotional toll extended beyond the immediate allegations, affecting families and communities that had relied on Long's guidance and leadership for decades. Long's ministry had, for years, employed sophisticated messaging and persuasive techniques to cultivate loyalty and compliance. Sermons emphasizing obedience, divine reward, and the moral imperative of giving were paired with public displays of generosity, philanthropy, and spiritual influence. By projecting an image of moral authority and spiritual success, Long was able to reinforce trust among followers, making it more difficult for congregants to question financial and personal demands. This manipulation of perception underscores the power of charisma and public image in consolidating authority, particularly in religious settings where personal devotion is deeply intertwined with moral and spiritual guidance. The legal proceedings, settlements, and media scrutiny led to significant repercussions for Long's public image and ministry operations. While criminal charges were not pursued, civil settlements required substantial financial compensation to the accusers, reflecting the material and emotional dimensions of the harm caused. Church operations faced increased scrutiny, and the congregation was forced to confront the reality that the leadership they had trusted had engaged in unethical, coercive, and financially exploitative practices. The fallout illustrated the vulnerability of followers to manipulation when faith, obedience, and financial support are intertwined. Beyond the immediate legal and financial consequences, the scandal had lasting psychological and social effects. Many congregants reported struggling with disillusionment, loss of trust in religious institutions, and difficulty reconciling their faith with the reality of Long's actions. Families who had encouraged participation in church initiatives experienced internal conflict, feeling guilt or responsibility for supporting leadership that ultimately betrayed their trust. The broader community faced the challenge of re-establishing trust in spiritual leaders while addressing the financial and emotional damage incurred. The case of Eddie Long highlights the dangers inherent in centralized spiritual authority, particularly when combined with financial solicitation and limited oversight. His ability to leverage charisma, media influence, and religious devotion to accumulate wealth and manipulate followers underscores the vulnerability of congregants to exploitation. It also demonstrates the importance of transparency, accountability, and ethical leadership within religious institutions, where the stakes involve not only financial resources but the spiritual and emotional well-being of individuals. Ultimately, Eddie Long's story serves as a cautionary tale about the consequences of prioritizing personal enrichment and control over moral responsibility. Followers trusted him with their faith, their finances, and their personal lives, and in return, many experienced exploitation, betrayal, and harm. His rise and fall illuminate the complex dynamics of power, faith, and accountability in religious organizations and serve as a reminder that spiritual authority carries profound ethical obligations that must never be subordinated to personal ambition or gain. The enduring lesson is clear: when pastors choose money and control over morals, the cost is borne by those who invest their trust, devotion, and resources. Long's story demonstrates how faith can be manipulated, wealth can be amassed, and trust can be shattered when ethical boundaries are ignored. For communities, families, and individual believers, the narrative underscores the need for vigilance, critical evaluation, and accountability in religious leadership. The consequences of betrayal in such contexts are profound, affecting lives, communities, and the broader perception of faith-based institutions. Eddie Long's ministry may have promised guidance, prosperity, and spiritual growth, but it delivered manipulation, exploitation, and moral compromise. His legacy serves as a stark reminder that trust placed in spiritual leaders is sacred, and that ethical responsibility must never be sacrificed for personal gain, wealth, or power. For those who are deceived, the emotional, financial, and spiritual impact remains a powerful testament to the dangers of unbridled authority in religious contexts. What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. The story of Paula White is an unsettling example of how spiritual authority can be leveraged for personal gain, and how the promise of divine favor can be converted into a tool for financial enrichment. Paula White, a high-profile prosperity gospel pastor and televangelist, rose to prominence in the 1990s and 2000s as a compelling speaker and spiritual advisor, later gaining national recognition as a spiritual consultant to political figures. Her ministry emphasized the idea that faith, obedience, and generous giving would bring tangible rewards from God, including financial blessings, health, and personal success. While her teachings attracted millions of followers worldwide, investigations and reports over the years raised serious questions about the use of donations, lavish spending, and the ethical boundaries of her ministry's financial practices. Born in 1966 in Tupelo, Mississippi, Paula White experienced a challenging childhood marked by poverty and familial instability. She discovered faith as a teenager and began preaching at local churches, demonstrating charisma, confidence, and a deep ability to connect with congregants. Her ministry quickly expanded through both church leadership roles and television broadcasting. White became known for her dynamic presence, inspirational messages, and the central promise of the prosperity gospel, that God would reward faithful and generous followers with material success. This message resonated deeply with those seeking hope, stability, and a sense of purpose, drawing a loyal base of congregants who trusted her guidance and leadership. White's ministry grew into a sprawling organization with multiple congregations, television programs, and global outreach efforts. Central to her financial strategy was the solicitation of donations framed as seed offerings, financial contributions that were portrayed as essential to unlocking God's blessings. Viewers and congregants were encouraged to give generously, often with the promise of specific returns, both spiritual and material. The approach was highly effective. Millions of dollars were raised annually, allowing the ministry to operate on a scale that included television production, event hosting, and international outreach. However, scrutiny arose when critics suggested that a significant portion of these funds was being diverted for personal enrichment, rather than charitable or spiritual purposes. Investigations into Paula White's finances revealed patterns of high-value property acquisitions, luxury travel, and personal expenditures that were funded by donations from followers. White reportedly owned multiple residences, used ministry funds to maintain a lavish lifestyle, and directed significant resources toward personal branding and media presence. While her supporters defended these expenditures as necessary to advance the ministry and reach more people, detractors argued that the disparity between the wealth of the pastor and the struggles of her followers demonstrated an exploitation of trust and faith. The ethical implications of such financial practices became a central point of public discussion, raising questions about the responsibilities of religious leaders toward their congregants. White's prominence increased when she became a spiritual advisor to political figures, a role that expanded her influence beyond traditional ministry channels. She was able to access a wider audience, receive national media attention, and further consolidate authority within faith-based communities. Yet the combination of political visibility and prosperity gospel messaging intensified scrutiny. Critics raised concerns about conflicts of interest, potential misrepresentation of donations, and the prioritization of personal visibility and influence over the spiritual and financial welfare of followers. The expansion of her platform illustrated how charisma, media presence, and perceived spiritual authority could be leveraged to attract significant resources and attention. The emotional and spiritual impact on followers was profound. Many individuals invested not only financially but emotionally, believing that their contributions would bring divine favor, personal blessings, and protection. When promises failed to materialize as anticipated, some followers experienced disappointment, disillusionment, and a crisis of faith. Others, witnessing the contrast between the luxury of White's lifestyle and their own financial struggles, reported feelings of betrayal and manipulation. The psychological toll of realizing that trust had been exploited highlighted the vulnerabilities of congregants who placed unwavering faith in charismatic leadership. Legal and financial scrutiny intensified in the 2000s and 2010s as non-profit watchdog groups, journalists, and critics examined the operations of Paula White Ministries. While no criminal charges were pursued, public and media scrutiny focused on the ethical and moral responsibilities of televangelists, the accountability mechanisms for donations, and the transparency of financial reporting. These investigations underscored the tension between freedom of religious expression and the need to protect followers from exploitation, particularly when donations are solicited under promises of divine reward. White's ministry also faced internal criticism from former employees and congregation members. Accounts described a culture in which dissent was discouraged, Questions about financial transparency were minimized, and leadership decisions were presented as divinely mandated. Followers who sought clarification or accountability were sometimes met with spiritual admonishment, reinforcing the dynamic in which obedience and financial support were tied closely to the perceived favor of God. This system of control allowed White to maintain authority, consolidate resources, and continue expanding her influence without significant internal resistance. The long-term consequences for followers were multifaceted. Financially, some donors experienced hardship after contributing substantial sums to the ministry. Emotionally and spiritually, the betrayal of trust led to disillusionment and, in some cases, a re-evaluation of religious beliefs. Communities that had embraced White's ministry faced the challenge of reconciling the public image of a devoted spiritual leader with the realities of financial mismanagement and exploitation. Scholars and theologians used the case as a lens to examine the risks inherent in prosperity gospel teachings, highlighting the potential for manipulation when spiritual authority is combined with financial solicitation. Ultimately, Paula White's story is a cautionary tale of how trust, faith, and devotion can be exploited when pastors prioritize personal wealth and public visibility over ethical responsibility. She promised divine favor, healing, and prosperity, but delivered financial manipulation and moral compromise. Her ministry serves as a powerful example of the dangers posed when spiritual authority is weaponized, and when followers' faith is monetized in ways that serve the personal ambitions of leaders. The enduring lesson from this scandal is the fragility of trust in religious leadership. Faithful followers can be manipulated when promises of divine reward are tied to financial contributions, creating a system in which obedience and giving are leveraged for personal gain. White's case underscores the critical need for transparency, accountability, and ethical conduct in religious organizations. The psychological, spiritual, and financial consequences of her actions demonstrate that the impact of such exploitation extends far beyond immediate donors, affecting families, communities, and the broader perception of faith-based institutions. For the millions who invested in Paula White's ministry, the experience was a profound betrayal. Donations meant to advance spiritual growth were redirected to personal wealth. Trust in spiritual leadership was undermined, and faith was shaken. Her story remains a compelling warning of the consequences when pastors choose money and influence over moral and ethical responsibility. The narrative challenges congregants, institutions, and society to remain vigilant, demanding integrity, accountability, and ethical leadership from those entrusted with guiding the spiritual lives of others. What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. The story of Creflo Dollar exposes how one of America's most high-profile prosperity gospel pastors used his religious influence to amass extraordinary personal wealth, raising questions about ethics, accountability, and the exploitation of faith. Creflo Dollar, founder of World Changers Church International in Atlanta, Georgia, became internationally recognized for his charismatic preaching, television broadcasts, and teachings on the principles of prosperity gospel. Two followers, Dollar represented a spiritual authority capable of guiding them toward divine favor, success, and blessings. Yet the enormous wealth he accumulated over decades, including private jets, luxury homes, and extravagant lifestyles, sparked widespread criticism, highlighting the potential for abuse when religious leadership intersects with unchecked financial power. Born in 1962 in College Park, Georgia, Creflo Dollar grew up in modest circumstances. Early on, he displayed a keen interest in ministry and public speaking, eventually founding World Changers Church International in 1986. The church began as a small congregation, but quickly expanded under Dollar's charismatic leadership. He utilized television, radio, and public events to reach a broader audience, emphasizing that God rewards faithfulness, generosity, and obedience with material and spiritual abundance. Central to his message was the concept of seed faith giving, the idea that donations to the ministry would yield tangible blessings in the donor's life. By the 1990s and 2000s, Dollar's ministry had become a multi-million-dollar operation. His television programs, including Creflo Dollar Ministries, aired globally, reaching millions of viewers. Donations poured in from congregants and television audiences who believed their contributions would unlock divine favor. While many followers experienced personal inspiration and community support, The revelations about Dollar's personal wealth sparked controversy. Reports detailed his ownership of multiple luxury homes, high-end vehicles, and private aircraft, all funded through donations from followers who were often struggling financially. Critics argued that Dollar's lifestyle reflected a stark contradiction between his teachings of modest stewardship and the reality of personal extravagance. The controversy surrounding Creflo Dollar intensified in the mid-2000s when his ministry became the focus of media investigations. Questions were raised regarding the transparency of financial practices, the allocation of donations, and the ethical implications of soliciting large sums from followers while maintaining a lifestyle of immense wealth. In particular, the purchase of a $65 million Gulfstream G650 private jet in 2015 drew national attention and criticism. Dollar defended the purchase, asserting that it was necessary for ministry operations. But the public response highlighted the perception of moral compromise and exploitation of trust. Followers' emotional and spiritual investment in Dollar's ministry was profound. Many had donated significant portions of their income with the expectation that their contributions would not only support the church's mission, but also bring blessings, healing, and success into their own lives. The revelation that large sums were used to fund the pastor's personal lifestyle rather than community projects created feelings of betrayal, disillusionment, and spiritual confusion. Families reported internal conflict, struggling to reconcile devotion to a pastor who preached prosperity and faith with the reality of lavish personal spending. The ethical debate surrounding Dollar's ministry extended beyond media criticism. Religious scholars, financial watchdogs, and community leaders questioned the responsibility of spiritual leaders to maintain transparency and accountability in managing donations. The prominence of prosperity gospel teachings, coupled with Dollar's high-profile persona, illustrated the inherent risks of concentrated spiritual authority. When a single leader controls both messaging and finances, the potential for exploitation increases, and followers are particularly vulnerable to manipulation. Dollar's defense often rested on theological justification. He maintained that the wealth of the pastor could be used as a tool to expand ministry outreach, fund charitable initiatives, and inspire followers to embrace the principles of faith-based financial success. To supporters, Dollar's wealth was a sign of God's favor, a manifestation of the very prosperity he preached. To critics, however, it was a glaring example of moral compromise, the accumulation of wealth at the expense of followers' trust and financial security, cloaked in the language of spiritual necessity. The long-term impact of Dollar's ministry on followers has been complex. While some congregants continue to find inspiration, guidance, and community support through his church, others have distanced themselves, disillusioned by the disparity between promises of spiritual prosperity and the reality of personal enrichment. Studies of prosperity gospel ministries indicate that such discrepancies can create cognitive dissonance, causing individuals to question faith, personal judgment, and the legitimacy of religious institutions. The psychological and emotional consequences are often compounded when individuals invest significant resources, both material and spiritual, into a ministry that prioritizes leadership enrichment over communal well-being. The public scrutiny surrounding Creflo Dollar's ministry also prompted discussions about regulatory oversight, financial accountability, and ethical responsibilities in religious organizations. While religious freedom protects the right of spiritual leaders to teach and solicit donations, the case underscores the tension between legal authority, moral responsibility, and the protection of vulnerable followers. Financial disclosure, independent audits, and governance structures are critical safeguards to ensure that donations are used in accordance with stated purposes, particularly in organizations wielding immense influence and authority. Ultimately, Creflo Dollar's story serves as a cautionary tale about the intersection of faith, wealth, and ethical responsibility. The promise of prosperity, when tied to financial contributions, can become a tool for exploitation, particularly when accountability structures are weak and authority is concentrated. Followers who invest emotionally, financially, and spiritually may be vulnerable to manipulation, highlighting the need for vigilance and critical evaluation in religious contexts. Dollar's ministry, while providing spiritual guidance to many, also illustrates the potential for harm when pastors prioritize personal enrichment over the welfare of their congregants. The combination of charisma, media reach, and the theological framing of financial giving created a system in which trust was leveraged for personal gain. The emotional, financial, and spiritual consequences for followers underscore the gravity of such exploitation and the enduring need for accountability, transparency, and ethical leadership in faith-based organizations. In the end, the story of Creflo Dollar is a vivid example of how the pursuit of wealth and influence can compromise the moral and ethical responsibilities of religious leaders. For those who placed their faith and finances in his hands, the experience was often transformative, but not always positively. While some found spiritual inspiration, others faced betrayal, disillusionment, and financial loss. The lessons are clear. Faith, trust, and devotion are sacred. And when pastors choose money over morals, the consequences ripple through the lives of countless followers, communities, and institutions that rely on integrity and ethical leadership. What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. For more real-life crime stories, subscribe and stay tuned for the next deep dive.